Welcome, comrades, to the art of cinema. I am Colonel T, your Minister of Propaganda.
And I am your overseer, your steward, your glorious leader, General Secretary F.
At number 4 on our list of the top 10 films of the 1990s, we have The Shawshank Redemption, sir.
And how do we know that's the case, Colonel?
Because you say so, sir.
That's right, for I am the mastermind of the revolution, and of film criticism as well, therefore.
In the first scene of the film, Tim Robbins is on trial for murdering his wife and her lover. The scene cuts between the courtroom and shots of Tim Robbins sitting outside in his car, drunk and loading a handgun, while his wife and her lover are together inside. Tim Robbins claims that he didn't go inside to confront them, that it wasn't him who killed them. But it's not a convincing story. The evidence at the scene of the crime certainly seems to indicate his guilt, and Tim Robbins seems aloof and unemotional on stand, so he can't win the jury over. Tim Robbins is convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences.
As you know, Colonel, there can be no murder in an atrocitarian utopia. Our workers and soldiers have no need of homicide, because they're fulfilled by their shared communal ownership of society's means of production. So in the People's Republic of F, Tim Robbins wouldn't have shot his wife and her lover because he'd have been busy at the factory making shoes or nails. On evenings and weekends, he'd have been back at the housing dormitory we'd provided for him, studying the General Secretary F manifesto and enjoying the fruit of his labor. But even if he hadn't shot his wife and her lover, I suspect that Tim Robbins probably harbored counter-revolutionary sympathies. Show me the suspect, Colonel, and I'll show you the crime. Prison is where this guy belongs then, as an enemy of the state.
Tim Robbins arrives at Shawshank Prison in 1947. It's an old, Gothic building made of stone that looks like a good set for a horror film. The inmates watch the arrival of Tim Robbins and the other new prisoners and place bets on who will be the first to break under the pressure on their first night. One of them finally does after lights out. He starts calling to be released, shouting that there's been a mistake, that he doesn't belong in prison. So Clancy Brown, the captain of the guard, pulls the prisoner out of his cell and beats him to death, setting a brutal example to keep the other prisoners in line. This is how we're introduced to the guards and to Bob Gunton, the warden. They're sadistic and brutal, sir.
They might seem to be sadistic and brutal in the film, Colonel, but remember, this is an American production. American filmmakers don't understand the politics of atrocity. They don't understand that atrocity, in the hands of a leader of genius and gloriousness, is the chisel by which he sculpts a utopian sculpture out of the rough-hewn societal granite he begins with.
No, sir. In fact, in The Shawshank Redemption, we're actually meant to identify with the prisoners, not with the warden and the guards.
And this is the basest American fraudulency. The common worker must identify with his glorious leader and to strive to be like his glorious leader. And I see real gloriousness in this Warden Bob Gunton character. Colonel, if The Shawshank Redemption had been a PRF production, the warden would be presented to us as the hero he truly is. But the Americans, they don't understand these things.
For all this talk of Tim Robbins, sir, Morgan Freeman is in fact our main character. He narrates the story, and we see things primarily from his perspective. When the new prisoners arrive, Morgan Freeman doesn't think much of Tim Robbins at first. In fact, Morgan Freeman put his bet on Tim Robbins to be the one to crack that first night. But the two start to get to know each other after Tim Robbins approaches Morgan Freeman in the yard one day. You see, sir, Morgan Freeman runs a sort of business for himself at Shawshank Prison, arranging to have contraband smuggled inside and selling it to the other prisoners. So Tim Robbins approaches Morgan Freeman to buy a small rock hammer from him. It's the beginning of the friendship that develops between them. The Shawshank Redemption is the story of that friendship and the redemption Morgan Freeman finds through it.
Morgan Freeman is our main character and he smuggles contraband into the prison?
That's right.
What? I'll tell you what Tim Robbins' rock hammer and the other contraband represents, Colonel. It represents the subversive, destructive, counter-revolutionary influence by which the Americans seek to corrupt Shawshank's society. How can the Vanguard Party foster a dictatorship of the proletariat there at Shawshank in the face of this American corruption?
Only through the iron fist by which Warden Bob Gunton rules over the inmates, sir.
That's right, Colonel. Warden Gunton must be for Shawshank Prison what I am for the PRF, the great man and man of deeds, the gardener of human happiness.
Before he'd been convicted of murder, Tim Robbins had been a banker and very intelligent, good at his job. So eventually, he gains the protection of Clancy Brown and the other guards by offering them free financial planning and other financial services. This brings Tim Robbins to the attention of Bob Gunton, the warden. Bob Gunton is corrupt, sir. Bob Gunton hires out the inmates as slave labor, undercutting local businesses. He takes kickbacks from those businesses in exchange for not competing with them, skims off the top of work contracts, launders money. And Bob Gunton has Tim Robbins do all the accounting as he carries out his frauds and scams. Tim Robbins is the in-house financial wizard that Bob Gunton needs to launder his money.
So again, we see Warden Bob Gunton, the true hero of the film, making the sacrifices that need to be made, getting it done. You know, it reminds me of the times I've had to buy grain from the Americans after the capitalist spies and infiltrators caused mass crop failures on our PRF farms. Unenlightened onlookers thought that meant that the PRF was corrupt, that the politics of atrocity didn't really work, or whatever nonsense. In reality, it was just that your glorious leader, General Secretary F, was doing what had to be done to forge ahead with the revolution. And that's something Warden Bob Gunton would understand.
In the 1960s, Gil Bellows, a young new inmate, arrives at Shawshank Prison. It turns out that Gil Bellows had done time elsewhere and had been the cellmate of the man who'd actually killed Tim Robbins' ex and her lover. So Tim Robbins is innocent of the crime, and Gil Bellows would be able to help him prove it in a new trial. But when Tim Robbins tells the warden about this, thinking that the warden would want to help him prove his innocence, Bob Gunton realizes that he can't let Tim Robbins out from under his control. The warden depends on Tim Robbins to run his scams, and if Tim Robbins were released from prison, he could expose the warden. So Bob Gunton has Tim Robbins sent to solitary confinement for 2 months, and has Gil Bellows shot and killed in a stage escape attempt. It would seem that the corrupt, sadistic warden has stolen the one hope Tim Robbins had of getting out of a life spent in prison for a crime he didn't commit. After Tim Robbins gets out of solitary, Morgan Freeman thinks that Tim Robbins has reached his breaking point. Has the warden's treachery finally broken Tim Robbins' spirit? Morgan Freeman learns that Tim Robbins has taken a 6-foot length of rope to his cell one night. It appears that Tim Robbins is going to hang himself.
The execution of Gil Bellows, the hanging of Tim Robbins, watching the warden make these tough but fair decisions, it's very much like me when I send hundreds of thousands of capitalist imperialist sympathizers to the Arctic labor camps each month for re-education, to stop them from compromising our agricultural and industrial collectives. Well done, Bob Gunton. It's good to see the story of this subversive Tim Robbins character come to an end.
Actually, it hasn't come to an end. The film has faked us out here, sir.
What? We've been deceived!
We have, sir. The next morning, when Tim Robbins doesn't come out of his cell for morning roll call, it's not because he's hanged himself in his cell. It's because he's escaped from Shawshank Prison.
Oh, fuck.
In a flashback scene, we see Tim Robbins using the rock hammer he bought from Morgan Freeman early in the film. Tim Robbins had only wanted the rock hammer for his hobby of carving small stones into chess pieces and other things, but one night he uses it to carve his name into the wall of his cell, and a large chunk of the cell wall breaks off and falls to the floor. Tim Robbins realizes that with enough time, he could in fact dig through the wall. So he has Morgan Freeman smuggle in a poster of Rita Hayworth that's large enough to cover over the hole he's digging into his cell wall. And every day, when Tim Robbins gets let out into the yard for exercise, he carries out the debris in his pockets and dumps it out of the legs of his pants as he walks around. After almost 20 years in prison, Tim Robbins escapes. The next morning, wearing some of the clothes he'd been dry cleaning for the warden, he visits banks and withdraws the warden's laundered money from them. He also mails proof of the warden's crimes to the local newspaper. So before long, the police arrive at Shawshank to arrest Bob Gunton, who puts a gun to his head. As Morgan Freeman puts it in his narration, I like to think that the last thing that went through the warden's head, other than that bullet, was to wonder how the hell Tim Robbins ever got the best of him.
So now we understand why the American censors allowed for the production and release of this film. Shawshank Prison is where Warden Gunton engineers the utopia. Shawshank Prison is analogous of the PRF then. But Tim Robbins defects from Shawshank, much like the counterrevolutionaries here attempt to escape through demilitarized zones on our borders. And what does Tim Robbins do as soon as he's defected?
He has Warden Gunton assassinated, sir.
That's right. Tim Robbins takes from the people of Shawshank their only hope of utopia, their beloved and respected leader, their ever-victorious, iron-willed commander. This is the American fantasy, you see. Since they can't eliminate me, your glorious leader, General Secretary F, they fantasize about it metaphorically through films like The Shawshank Redemption.
Yes, sir. It's really all about you, sir. The Shawshank Redemption isn't really about Tim Robbins' prison break, though, sir. It's about the hope he inspires in Morgan Freeman. There's a scene in which Tim Robbins tells Morgan Freeman and the other inmates why music means so much to him. It's because music inspires something in your soul that even prison can't take from you. The hope you can keep of a world with beauty in it, a world that's not made of stone. But when Morgan Freeman hears this, he tells Tim Robbins, hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane. It's got no use on the inside. You better get used to that idea. James Whitmore plays a very old inmate in the film who's released after 50 years at Shawshank. But James Whitmore can't handle life on the outside after all that time. He's been institutionalized and can't cope with his freedom. So James Whitmore hangs himself, prison having reduced him to being a man without hope. James Whitmore shows us what Morgan Freeman would have become as well, had it not been for his friendship with Tim Robbins. Just before Tim Robbins escapes from Shawshank, he makes Morgan Freeman promise that if he ever gets out, he'll go to a certain place where Tim Robbins has left something buried in the ground for him. So Morgan Freeman is finally paroled one day, and even though he finds that he can't handle life on the outside any more than James Whitmore could, he remembers the promise he made to Tim Robbins. He finds the place Tim Robbins told him about and digs up an envelope with a letter in it, and the money Morgan Freeman will need to travel to Mexico. The letter says, "Remember, Morgan Freeman, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." This coda to the film, with Morgan Freeman out of prison and redeemed by the hope his friend inspired in him, is truly beautiful.
So Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman defect from Shawshank and go live in the United States. But do they find fulfillment in the U.S.? No. So Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman have to retreat into this fantasy about a beachfront paradise in Mexico just to cope. We should read The Shawshank Redemption as a cautionary tale for the workers and soldiers of the PRF then. Many will remember the Berlin Wall, which was unfortunately dismantled in 1989. It was a sad story, but the good news is that here in the PRF, we have the new F-City Wall, the F-Ograd Wall, the F-Garad Wall, which is not to be confused with the F-Ograd Wall, the F-Berg Wall, and many, many others. These walls don't make our cities into prisons, Colonel.
Certainly not, sir.
The walls are there to protect any PRF workers with counter-revolutionary ideas from making the terrible mistake of defecting. If there are counter-revolutionary ideas that seem to make sense to any of our workers or soldiers, they shouldn't try to defect. They should embrace the compulsory 10-year re-education program we submit them to in our Arctic labor camps instead. I can promise that after those 10 years are up, you'll never doubt the revolution again.
If you survive those 10 years, that is.
Well, of course. And if you doubt me, just watch The Shawshank Redemption and see the empty wasteland, the dystopia that Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman find themselves in after they defect from Shawshank. Warden Gunton tells Tim Robbins in the film that salvation lies within. On the surface, he seems to be talking about the Bible, but a more astute reading reveals the truth of the matter. Salvation, or the titular redemption of the film, lies within the state, the People's Republic of F. And fortunately for our workers and soldiers, we've made sure that they'll never ever be able to leave.
This has been The Art of Cinema with our glorious leader, General Secretary F. Let us maintain vigilance against the ever-looming threat of an American invasion. You are required to report any non-participation or dissent amongst your comrades. Don't forget to tune into The Art of Cinema again next time to find out which film from the 1990s is ranked at number 5 in your next mandatory re-education session.